On the morning of May 27th, 1940, at precisely 0742, Captain Jack Churchill found himself crouched low behind a deteriorating stone wall in the vicinity of the French village of L'Épinette. Through the morning fog, he observed 5 German soldiers making their way toward where he was positioned. He was 33 years of age, and it had been 14 years since his time at Sandhurst. His combat record showed 0 confirmed kills. The Wehrmacht forces had already overwhelmed Poland in just 36 days. At this moment, their panzer units were tearing across France at a rate of 40 miles each day, while the complete British Expeditionary Force was making a desperate run toward the sea. In the previous 72 hours alone, Churchill's company had suffered the loss of 11 men. The Germans possessed superior tanks, superior aircraft, and superior coordination. British soldiers were falling by the hundreds along every route that led to Dunkirk. What had begun as a retreat was rapidly becoming a rout. Officers could be seen burning classified documents in roadside ditches. Sergeants were burying whatever equipment they couldn't transport. Private soldiers were discarding their rifles simply to run faster toward the coast. But Jack Churchill wasn't running. What he carried was a 6-foot English longbow with a draw weight of 70 pounds, capable of an effective range of 200 yards when wielded by a skilled archer. And Churchill was indeed skilled. Just 11 months prior, he had represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships held in Oslo. He had placed 26th among 63 competitors representing 14 different nations. While not a champion, his skill was sufficient to send an arrow through a playing card at 50 yards, sufficient to end a man's life before that man could even hear the shot. The German patrol had now closed to 30 yards. The distance was adequate. Churchill could make out the sergeant who was leading them, someone who appeared to be a veteran based on how carefully he moved, likely a man who had participated in the Polish campaign. The sergeant's eyes were scanning the hedgeline, checking windows, searching for the standard threats: rifles, machine guns, grenades. The idea of watching for a medieval weapon never crossed his mind. Churchill pulled the bowstring back until it reached his ear. The yew-wood made a creaking sound under the tension. His fingers located the familiar anchor position on the string, the identical position he had used perhaps 10,000 times during practice. This exact shot had been made countless times against targets. Never before had he made it with a human being positioned at the other end. The arrow took flight. The German sergeant collapsed without making a sound, the shaft embedded deeply in his chest. This marked the first confirmed longbow kill in any European war since the 17th century. It would stand as the last confirmed longbow kill throughout the entire Second World War. And it occurred because a single British officer refused to accept the notion that modern warfare had rendered ancient weapons obsolete. The British Army found itself uncertain about what to do with Jack Churchill. His graduation from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst had occurred in 1926, followed by service with the Manchester Regiment in Burma. An entire decade had been spent learning the ways of a conventional infantry officer. Then, in 1936, he had departed the army completely because peacetime soldiering brought him nothing but exhaustion through boredom. His work as a newspaper editor in Nairobi, Kenya, followed. Film appearances as an archer and bagpipe player came next, including a minor role in The Thief of Baghdad. He had ridden motorcycles across 1,500 miles of Burma and India, once colliding with a water buffalo on a rural road. When war erupted in September 1939, Churchill wasted no time rejoining his regiment, though not as a conventional officer. He brought along his longbow, the same weapon used in international competition. He brought his Scottish broadsword, a basket-hilted claymore of the type his ancestors had carried into battle centuries before. And he brought a set of Highland bagpipes that he had taught himself to play during his Burma years. His fellow officers considered him eccentric at best, potentially mentally unstable at worst. His commanding officers viewed him as a liability. The War Office possessed no regulation addressing officers who desired to carry medieval weapons into battle against panzer divisions equipped with 88mm guns. Churchill gave no consideration to what any of them thought. His study of military history had been extensive. He understood that modern rifles possessed greater accuracy than longbows at extended range. He knew that a Mauser could fire 15 rounds per minute while a longbow might loose perhaps 10. But he also understood something that the tacticians in London had let slip from memory. During close combat, in the chaos that accompanies an ambush, in the terror of hand-to-hand fighting, psychological warfare held as much weight as raw firepower. A man charging with a broadsword and a Highland war cry inspired more terror than a man pointing a rifle from cover. And a man capable of killing silently with an arrow before you even detected his presence possessed an advantage that no amount of modern technology could replicate. Between May 26th and June 4th, 1940, the British Expeditionary Force evacuated 338,000 soldiers from the beaches of Dunkirk. The majority departed, leaving behind their weapons, their vehicles, their equipment, their pride. They returned home, defeated, exhausted, anticipating a German invasion within weeks. Jack Churchill returned home with his bow, his sword, and his bagpipes. He had provided cover for his company's retreat. He had eliminated enemy soldiers using weapons that belonged in a museum, and he was only beginning. If you're interested in seeing how Churchill's medieval arsenal performed against the Wehrmacht's elite forces, please hit that like button. It truly helps us share these forgotten stories with more people. Subscribe if you haven't done so already. Back to Churchill. Within weeks following his return from Dunkirk, Churchill volunteered for a new unit the War Office was forming in secret. They called themselves the Commandos. The training would prove brutal beyond anything the British Army had ever attempted. The missions would consist of suicidal raids into Nazi-occupied territory. Casualty rates were anticipated to be catastrophic. Churchill requested permission to bring his sword and bow on operations. The Commandos approved. By December 1941, he would find himself leading men onto a frozen Norwegian beach at dawn, bagpipes screaming into the Arctic wind, broadsword raised high above his head, prepared to demonstrate that sometimes the oldest methods of war remained the deadliest. The British Commandos were born from sheer desperation. In June 1940, Britain stood isolated against Nazi Germany. The army had lost the majority of its equipment at Dunkirk. An invasion appeared imminent. Prime Minister Winston Churchill demanded a force capable of striking back at the enemy, if only to prove that Britain continued to fight. The concept was simple yet brutal. Small teams of highly trained soldiers would conduct raids on the coastlines of occupied Europe. They would destroy facilities, eliminate Germans, gather intelligence, and vanish before reinforcements could arrive. The missions would carry danger, the training would prove harder. Volunteers only. Jack Churchill volunteered without hesitation. He joined No. 3 Commando in late 1940 and threw himself completely into the training program. The Commandos trained in Scotland in the mountains surrounding Achnacarry Castle. They marched 30 miles daily, carrying full equipment. They practiced amphibious landings in freezing water. They learned to kill silently using knives, garrotes, and bare hands. Live ammunition was fired over each other's heads during exercises. Men unable to maintain the pace were returned to their original units in disgrace. Churchill excelled at everything. His age exceeded that of most volunteers, yet he proved stronger and more determined. He could march longer, shoot straighter, and fight harder than men a decade younger, and he brought skills no other commando possessed. He could place an arrow into a target at 200 yards. He could play the bagpipes while marching into battle. He could handle a broadsword with the skill of a medieval knight. The other commandos initially didn't know what to make of him. Some believed he was showing off. Others genuinely thought him insane. But as training progressed, they began understanding his logic. Churchill wasn't carrying ancient weapons because he believed them superior to modern firearms. He carried them because war involved more than just killing. War involved psychology. War involved fear. A German soldier facing a rifle understood what to expect. He had trained against rifles. He comprehended the threat. But a German soldier confronting a screaming madman wielding a sword and bagpipes had no training for such a situation. His mind would freeze for a critical second while attempting to process what he was witnessing. And in combat, a second of hesitation meant death. By autumn 1941, Churchill had received a promotion to second in command of No. 3 Commando. The unit had conducted several small raids along the Norwegian coast, though nothing significant. Then, in November, orders arrived from Combined Operations Headquarters. No. 3 Commando would lead a major assault on the German garrison at Vagsø, a small island on the Norwegian coast. The operation received the codename Archery. The target held strategic importance. Vagsø controlled access to a network of fjords that German ships used for transporting iron ore from Sweden. The island housed a garrison of approximately 150 German soldiers, 4 coastal artillery guns, and an anti-aircraft battery. The town of South Vagsø contained fish oil factories the Germans were using to produce glycerin for explosives. The plan called for a dawn assault on December 27, 1941. Royal Navy cruisers would bombard the German positions. Royal Air Force bombers would provide air cover. Then the commandos would land on multiple beaches simultaneously, overwhelming the defenders before they could organize a coherent defense. Churchill studied the intelligence reports obsessively. The German garrison was well trained and well equipped. They possessed machine guns, mortars, and prepared defensive positions. The coastal artillery could sink the landing craft before they even reached the beach. The attack would need to be fast, violent, and overwhelming. He requested permission to lead the first wave onto Mayaløy Island, a small fortified position guarding the approach to South Vagsø. Permission was granted. He requested permission to carry his sword and play his bagpipes during the assault. Permission was granted, though several senior officers questioned his sanity. The night before the raid, Churchill checked his equipment one final time. His broadsword was sharp, his bagpipes were tuned. He had grenades, a revolver, and a Thompson submachine gun as backup, but he intended to lead the charge with steel and music, not bullets. The commandos loaded onto their transport ships on Christmas Day 1941. They sailed north through the Arctic darkness, past the coast of Scotland into the Norwegian Sea. The temperature dropped below freezing. Ice formed on the deck railings. The men huddled in their quarters, checking weapons, writing letters home, trying not to think about what was coming. Churchill spent the voyage studying maps and rehearsing signals with his men. He had 105 commandos under his direct command. Their objective was to neutralize the German shore battery on Mayaløy Island within 10 minutes of landing. If they failed, the entire operation would collapse. German artillery would destroy the landing craft. Hundreds of British soldiers would die in the freezing water. At 8:45 on December 27th, the transport ships reached their launch position 12 miles off the Norwegian coast. The landing craft were lowered into the black water. The commandos climbed down the cargo nets in full combat gear. Churchill took his position in the bow of the lead craft, bagpipes in hand, sword at his belt. In 90 minutes, he would either be dead or legendary. The landing craft carrying Jack Churchill and 105 commandos approached Mayaløy Island through a curtain of smoke. Royal Air Force Hampden bombers had dropped smoke canisters along the shoreline to blind the German gunners. The cruiser HMS Kenya was firing salvos at the shore battery, her 6-inch guns thundering across the fjord. Explosions illuminated the Norwegian coast like lightning. Churchill stood in the bow of the lead craft, fully exposed to enemy fire. The other commandos crouched behind the steel gunwales, but their commander remained standing. He had his bagpipes inflated and ready. The shore was 200 yards away. Then 150. Then 100. At 8:48 on December 27th, 1941, the ramp of Churchill's landing craft dropped onto the rocky beach of Mayaløy Island. Before any of his men could move, Churchill stepped forward into the freezing surf and began playing the March of the Cameron Men. The sound of the bagpipes cut through the explosions and gunfire like a blade through cloth. It was the most Scottish sound in the world, and it was emanating from a beach in Nazi-occupied Norway. The Germans in the shore battery heard it and couldn't believe what they were hearing. They had been trained to fight British soldiers with rifles and grenades. They had not been trained to fight a madman playing music while walking calmly toward their guns. Churchill finished the tune, set down his bagpipes, pulled a grenade from his belt, and hurled it at the nearest German position. Then he drew his broadsword and charged up the beach, screaming at his men to follow. The commandos surged forward behind him, firing their Thompson submachine guns and Enfield rifles. The Germans attempted to respond, but they were disorganized, confused, still trying to comprehend what was happening. The assault on Malloy Island took less than 10 minutes. Churchill led his men through the German positions systematically, clearing bunkers and gun emplacements one by one. The 4 coastal artillery guns were destroyed with explosive charges. The anti-aircraft battery was overrun and captured. The German commander was taken prisoner along with 15 of his men. Those Germans who tried to resist were killed. Those who surrendered were bound and sent to the beach for evacuation. Churchill was everywhere during the assault. He appeared at the front of every attack, sword in hand, directing his men with shouts and gestures. One German soldier attempted to disarm a commando named Peter Young during the fighting. Young killed him with a single shot. Another German, badly wounded and screaming in agony, was given a mercy killing by a British bullet. War at close quarters was brutal and fast. By 9, Malloy Island was secure. Churchill received a radio message from the main assault force attacking the town of South Vagso. They were meeting heavy resistance. German reinforcements had arrived overnight, and the garrison was larger than intelligence had estimated. Street fighting had broken out in the town centre. Casualties were mounting. Churchill gathered his remaining men and commandeered a landing craft to cross the narrow strait to South Vagso. He arrived to find chaos. German snipers were firing from windows and rooftops. Machine gun nests covered the main streets. British commandos were pinned down behind walls and inside buildings, unable to advance. The commander of the main assault force, Lieutenant Colonel John Durnford Slater, needed Churchill's men to break the deadlock. Churchill deployed his commandos into the fight immediately. He personally led a flanking attack down a side street, sword drawn, moving from cover to cover. The Germans fell back under the pressure, unable to hold their positions against attackers coming from multiple directions. The battle for South Vagso lasted until mid-afternoon. The commandos systematically cleared the town building by building, room by room. They destroyed the fish oil factories with demolition charges. They captured German documents and code books. They took over 100 prisoners, but the victory came at a cost. 17 British commandos were killed in the fighting. 53 more were wounded. Churchill emerged from the battle without a scratch. His sword had blood on it. His bagpipes were undamaged. His reputation was made. The raid on Vagso was the first major commando success of the war. It proved that small, highly trained forces could strike deep into enemy territory and inflict serious damage. It proved that aggressive tactics and psychological warfare could overcome fortified positions. And it proved that Jack Churchill's medieval methods were not madness. They were effective. The German High Command was furious about the Vagso raid. Adolf Hitler himself issued orders strengthening coastal defences throughout Norway. 30,000 additional troops were diverted to garrison duty along the Norwegian coast, troops that could have been fighting in Russia or North Africa. A single raid by 300 commandos had tied down an entire army. Word of Churchill's exploits spread through the British military. The officer who played bagpipes into battle, the madman with the broadsword. Newspapers ran stories about him. Commanders requested him for their operations. The War Office stopped questioning his unusual equipment choices. By the summer of 1943, Churchill had been promoted to commanding officer of No. 2 Commando. His next mission would take him to the beaches of Sicily, to the mountains of Italy, and to the most audacious prisoner capture of the entire war. 42 Germans were about to learn that surrendering to a man with a sword was preferable to dying on his blade. The Allied invasion of Sicily began on July 9, 1943. Operation Husky was the largest amphibious assault in history up to that point. 160,000 troops from Britain, America, and Canada landed on the southern coast of the island within the first 3 days. The objective was to knock Italy out of the war and open a second front against Nazi Germany. No. 2 Commando landed at Catania on the eastern coast of Sicily under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill. He came ashore carrying his complete arsenal, Scottish broadsword around his waist, longbow and arrows slung across his back, bagpipes tucked under his arm. His men no longer questioned his equipment choices. They had witnessed what he could do at Vargso. They trusted him completely. The fighting in Sicily was brutal. The Germans had reinforced the Italian garrison with elite parachute troops and panzer divisions. Every village became a fortress. Every road became an ambush site. The Allies advanced slowly, taking casualties at every step. Churchill led his commandos through the mountainous terrain, bypassing enemy strongpoints, striking at supply lines, gathering intelligence on German positions. By September, Sicily had fallen, and the Allies were preparing to invade mainland Italy. The plan called for landings at Salerno, south of Naples. Intelligence suggested the Germans were expecting an attack further north near Rome. The Salerno beaches would be lightly defended. The invasion would be straightforward. The intelligence was wrong. Number 2, Commando landed at Salerno on September 9, 1943. They immediately encountered fierce resistance. The Germans had anticipated the invasion and reinforced the area with panzer divisions and artillery. The beachhead came under heavy fire within hours of the landing. American and British troops were pinned down, unable to advance. The entire operation was in danger of collapsing. Churchill's commandos were assigned to defend a critical road and rail junction at the town of Vietri sul Mare, overlooking the western half of the Bay of Salerno. If the Germans captured Vietri, they could pour artillery fire onto the Allied beaches. The landing force would be destroyed. For 5 consecutive days, Churchill and his men held Vietri against repeated German counterattacks. They fought from buildings, from ditches, from rubble. They repelled infantry assaults and tank probes. They called in naval gunfire on German positions. They refused to give ground even when ammunition ran low and casualties mounted. On the night of September 14th, Churchill received new orders. German forces had occupied the hills above the town of Molina, controlling a strategic pass leading down to the Salerno beachhead. An observation post on those hills was directing artillery fire onto Allied positions. The observation post had to be eliminated. Churchill studied the terrain. A frontal assault up the hills would be suicidal. The Germans had machine guns covering every approach. They had mortars zeroed in on the obvious routes. Any large force would be detected and destroyed before reaching the objective. He decided on a different approach. He would take a single corporal and infiltrate the German positions at night. 2 men could move silently where 200 could not. 2 men could capture what 200 could not take by force. Churchill and the corporal left the British lines after midnight. They moved through the darkness using terrain features for cover. They avoided German sentries by crawling through drainage ditches and along stone walls. The night was black. The Germans were not expecting an attack from 2 men armed with a sword and a revolver. They reached the first German position just before dawn. Churchill spotted the glow of cigarettes in the darkness. German soldiers were manning a mortar position, relaxed, not expecting trouble. Churchill drew his broadsword and approached silently. He appeared out of the darkness like a ghost from another century. The Germans surrendered immediately. They had never seen anything like this officer with his medieval weapon and his calm demeanour. Churchill used his revolver lanyard as a rope to lead the first prisoner to the next position. He repeated the process. Each time he approached silently, revealed himself suddenly, and demanded surrender. Each time the Germans complied, they were too shocked to resist. By dawn, Churchill and his corporal had captured 42 German soldiers and an entire mortar squad. They marched their prisoners back down the path to the British lines. The wounded Germans were placed on carts and pushed by their fellow prisoners. Churchill later described the scene as an image from the Napoleonic Wars. He received the Distinguished Service Order for the action at Molina. The citation praised his courage, his initiative, and his leadership. It did not mention that he had accomplished the entire capture with a sword. Some things were too unusual, even for official military records. The Salerno beachhead was secured by September 20th. The Allies began their long advance up the Italian peninsula toward Rome. Churchill and his commandos continued to operate ahead of the main force, raiding German positions, capturing prisoners, disrupting enemy communications. His reputation had spread beyond the British military. German soldiers began telling stories about the British officer with the sword and bagpipes. They called him a madman, a berserker, a throwback to an earlier age of warfare. Some refused to believe he was real. Others hoped they would never encounter him in battle. By the spring of 1944, the war in Italy had become a grinding stalemate. The Germans held the high ground along the Gustav Line. The Allies needed to open new fronts to stretch German resources thin. Churchill received orders transferring No. 2 Commando to Yugoslavia. They would support partisan fighters against German occupation forces. The mission would be dangerous, the terrain would be brutal, and the Germans would be waiting for the madman with the sword. The Germans in Yugoslavia had heard the stories about Jack Churchill long before he arrived. Intelligence reports had circulated through Wehrmacht headquarters, describing the British officer who carried a sword and played bagpipes in combat. Some officers dismissed the reports as propaganda. Others took them seriously. All of them underestimated what Churchill was capable of doing. By the spring of 1944, Yugoslavia had become one of the most brutal theatres of the war. German occupation forces controlled the cities and major roads, but communist partisans under Josip Broz Tito dominated the mountains and forests. The fighting was savage. Prisoners were rarely taken on either side. Entire villages were destroyed in reprisal attacks. The Germans had deployed over 500,000 troops to Yugoslavia, and they were still losing ground. The British government decided to support Tito's partisans with weapons, supplies, and military advisors. The commandos would provide direct combat support for partisan operations. Churchill and No. 2 Commando were transferred to the Adriatic island of Vis in April 1944. From there they would launch raids against German positions along the Dalmatian coast. Churchill threw himself into the new mission with characteristic enthusiasm. He studied the terrain, learned the partisan tactics, and planned operations against German supply lines. The partisans were impressed by his aggression and his willingness to fight alongside them. The Germans were about to learn that the madman with the sword had arrived in their sector. The first raids were successful. Churchill led attacks on German outposts, destroying equipment and capturing prisoners. He moved through the mountains with his sword and bagpipes, inspiring the partisans with his fearlessness. The Germans responded by reinforcing their garrisons and increasing patrols. They knew something had changed. The raids were more coordinated, more aggressive, more effective. In May 1944, Churchill received orders to capture the German-held island of Brac. The island controlled shipping lanes along the Dalmatian coast. A German garrison of several hundred soldiers held fortified positions overlooking the beaches. Taking Brac would require a major assault. Churchill assembled his force. He had 43 commandos from No. 43 Commando, a troop from No. 40 Commando, and approximately 1,500 Yugoslav partisans. It was a mixed force with mixed capabilities. The British commandos were highly trained professionals. The partisans were brave, but poorly equipped and loosely disciplined. Coordinating them in a complex amphibious assault would be difficult. The landing on Brac was unopposed. The Germans had pulled back from the beaches to prepare defensive positions in the hills. Churchill landed with his men on the night of May 2nd, 1944. The partisans were supposed to advance immediately toward the German positions. Instead, they hesitated. The partisan commanders saw the strength of the German fortifications and decided to wait until morning. Churchill was furious. Delay gave the Germans time to reinforce, time to prepare, time to call for support. But he could not force the partisans to attack. He had to wait with them through the long night, knowing that surprise had been lost. The assault began the following morning. No. 43 Commando launched a flanking attack on the German positions, while Churchill led elements from No. 40 Commando in a direct assault. The partisans remained at the landing area, providing no support. Churchill and his commandos were on their own. The Germans were ready for them. Machine gun fire swept the approaches to the hilltop positions. Mortar rounds exploded among the advancing commandos. Churchill pushed forward anyway, bagpipes playing, sword at his side, urging his men up the slope. The attack stalled. Men were falling. Ammunition was running low. A German mortar team had zeroed in on Churchill's position. They fired a salvo of rounds directly into the group of commandos gathered around their commander. The explosions killed or wounded every man except Churchill himself. He survived only because he had been standing slightly apart from the group, playing his bagpipes to encourage the attack. Churchill found himself alone on a hillside in enemy territory. His men were dead or dying around him. The Germans were advancing toward his position. Ammunition was exhausted. Escape was impossible. He did what any officer of his character would do. He sat down on a rock, picked up his bagpipes, and began playing Will Ye, No Come Back Again. It was a Scottish lament, a song of farewell, a final act of defiance against an enemy that had finally caught up with him. The Germans approached cautiously. They could not believe what they were seeing. A British officer surrounded by the bodies of his men, playing music while they pointed rifles at him. They did not shoot. They were too confused, too curious, perhaps too respectful of a man who faced death with such composure. A German grenade exploded near Churchill, knocking him unconscious. When he awoke, he was a prisoner. The Germans transported Churchill to Berlin for interrogation. They were convinced that anyone named Churchill must be related to the British Prime Minister. They flew him to the capital under heavy guard, hoping to extract valuable intelligence about Allied plans. They were disappointed. Jack Churchill had no connection to Winston Churchill. He was not privy to strategic secrets. He was simply an officer who liked swords and bagpipes. The Germans sent him to Sachsenhausen concentration camp north of Berlin. It was a special compound for prominent prisoners, including politicians, resistance leaders, and suspected relatives of important figures. Churchill was placed among men who had plotted against Hitler, men who had defied the Nazi regime, men who expected to be executed at any moment. For most prisoners, Sachsenhausen was the end. For Jack Churchill, it was merely an inconvenience. Within 4 months, he would escape. Within 8 months, he would be fighting again. The Germans had captured the madman with the sword, but they had not broken him. Sachsenhausen concentration camp was not designed for men like Jack Churchill. The camp held political prisoners, resistance fighters, and enemies of the Nazi state. Most inmates spent their days in forced labor, slowly starving under brutal conditions. Many never left alive. The SS guards expected obedience, despair, and eventual death from their prisoners. Churchill gave them none of these things. He was placed in a special compound called Sonderlager A, reserved for prominent prisoners who might have value as hostages or bargaining chips. His fellow inmates included diplomats, politicians, military officers, and suspected relatives of Allied leaders. Among them were 3 Royal Air Force officers who had participated in the Great Escape from Stalag Luft III in March 1944. 50 of their comrades had been executed by the Gestapo after that escape. These 3 had survived only because they were considered potentially valuable. Churchill immediately began planning his own escape. He studied the camp layout, the guard rotations, the fence lines, the watchtower positions. He identified weaknesses in the perimeter. He recruited allies among his fellow prisoners. Within weeks of his arrival, he had a plan. The prisoners in Sonderlager A had access to a small garden area near the perimeter fence. Churchill and his conspirators began digging a tunnel from a drainage ditch in the garden. They worked at night, concealing the excavated dirt under piles of compost. They used spoons, pieces of metal, and their bare hands to claw through the earth. The tunnel extended 110 meters, passing under the fence and emerging in a wooded area beyond the camp perimeter. On September 23, 1944, Churchill and 4 other British officers crawled through the tunnel to freedom. They emerged into the darkness beyond Sachsenhausen and scattered into the German countryside. Churchill paired with squadron leader Bertram James, one of the great escape survivors. Their plan was to walk north to the Baltic coast, approximately 200 kilometers away, and find a boat to neutral Sweden. For 2 weeks, Churchill and James moved through Nazi Germany on foot. They travelled at night and hid during the day. They stole vegetables from fields and drank from streams. They avoided roads, towns, and anywhere Germans might spot 2 ragged men who didn't speak the language. The weather was turning cold. Their clothes were inadequate. They had no maps, no compass, no supplies beyond what they could steal. They made it to within a few kilometers of the Baltic coast before their luck ran out. A German patrol spotted them near the town of Rostock and demanded identification. Churchill and James had none. They were arrested, interrogated, and identified as escaped prisoners from Sachsenhausen. The Germans returned them to captivity, but not to Sachsenhausen. Churchill was transferred to a camp in Austria, deep in the Alps, far from any Allied lines. The war was clearly turning against Germany by late 1944. The Soviets were advancing from the east. The Allies were pushing through France toward the Rhine. But for a prisoner in an Austrian mountain camp, liberation seemed impossibly distant. Churchill spent the winter of 1944–45 as a prisoner. He watched as Germany collapsed around him. Allied bombers flew overhead daily. News filtered in about Soviet advances, about the fall of Berlin, about Hitler's increasingly desperate orders. The guards became nervous, uncertain, aware that they might soon face justice for their crimes. In late April 1945, Churchill and approximately 140 other prominent prisoners were transferred from Austria to the Tyrol region of Italy. The SS planned to use them as hostages, bargaining chips in negotiations with the advancing Allies. The prisoners were marched through the mountains under heavy guard, not knowing if they would be released or executed. The end came unexpectedly. A delegation of prisoners approached senior Wehrmacht officers and expressed their fear of being murdered by the SS. The officers listened. A German army unit commanded by Captain Richard von Alvensleben moved in to protect the prisoners. The Wehrmacht soldiers outnumbered the SS guards. After a tense standoff, the SS withdrew. The prisoners were abandoned in a small Italian village, free but stranded in enemy territory. Most of the liberated prisoners waited for Allied forces to arrive. Jack Churchill did not wait. He had been a prisoner for nearly a year. He had escaped once, been recaptured, and survived. He was not going to sit in a village while there was still a war to fight. Churchill began walking south toward Allied lines. He covered 150 kilometers on foot through the Italian Alps, crossing mountain passes and avoiding German stragglers. His ankle was injured. He had no food, no weapons, no identification. He walked anyway. After 8 days, he reached the town of Verona and encountered an American armored reconnaissance unit. The Americans didn't know what to make of the ragged British officer who appeared out of the mountains, claiming to be a Commando lieutenant colonel. Churchill had no documents, no uniform insignia, nothing to prove his identity. He convinced them by sheer force of personality, by the authority in his voice, by the stories he told of swords and bagpipes and German prisoners captured at knife point. The Americans sent him back to Britain through military channels. Churchill arrived home in May 1945, just as the war in Europe was ending. Germany had surrendered. The concentration camps were being liberated. The fighting in Europe was over. But the war was not over. Japan was still fighting in the Pacific. Thousands of British soldiers were still dying in Burma, in Malaya, in the islands of Southeast Asia. Churchill immediately requested a transfer to the Far East. He wanted to fight the Japanese. He wanted to carry his sword into one more battle, to play his bagpipes on one more beach, to prove that the old ways of war still had meaning in the modern age. The War Office approved his request. By summer 1945, Jack Churchill was on a ship heading east toward Burma, toward Japan, toward what he hoped would be the final chapter of his war. He had no way of knowing that 2 atomic bombs were about to change everything. Jack Churchill was somewhere over India when the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. It was August 6, 1945. A single American B-29 bomber had dropped a weapon that killed 80,000 people in an instant. 3 days later, a second bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan announced its surrender. The Second World War was over. Churchill received the news with bitter disappointment. He had spent months preparing for the invasion of Japan. He had studied Japanese tactics, Japanese fortifications, Japanese fighting spirit. He had planned to lead commandos onto Japanese beaches with his sword and bagpipes, just as he had done in Norway, Sicily, and Yugoslavia. Now there would be no invasion, no final battle, no chance to test himself against one more enemy. His reaction became legendary among those who served with him. He reportedly complained that without the American atomic bombs, the war could have continued for another 10 years. It was a dark joke, but it revealed something true about Churchill's character. He was a man who thrived in combat, who found meaning in the chaos of war, who felt most alive when death was closest. Peace was a foreign country to him. The British military didn't know what to do with Jack Churchill after the war ended. He was too aggressive for peacetime garrison duty, too eccentric for staff positions, too famous to ignore. His service record was extraordinary. Distinguished Service Order with bar, Military Cross with bar, mentioned in dispatches multiple times. He had fought in France, Norway, Sicily, Italy, and Yugoslavia. He had escaped from a concentration camp. He had captured 42 prisoners with a sword. The War Office assigned him to administrative duties in Burma, helping to oversee the transition from war to peace. Churchill found the work tedious. He had no patience for paperwork, no interest in bureaucracy, no talent for the diplomatic compromises that peacetime required. He requested transfers to active units. He volunteered for dangerous assignments. He looked for any opportunity to return to the kind of soldiering he understood. By 1946, the British Empire was collapsing. India was demanding independence. Palestine was descending into chaos. Colonial territories across Africa and Asia were stirring with nationalist movements. The world that Churchill had fought to defend was transforming into something unrecognizable. Churchill was transferred to Palestine in 1947 as second-in-command of the 1st Battalion Highland Light Infantry. The situation was explosive. Jewish refugees from the Holocaust were flooding into the territory demanding a homeland. Arab Palestinians were resisting what they saw as an invasion. British soldiers were caught in the middle, trying to maintain order while both sides attacked them. The violence escalated throughout 1947 and into 1948. Jewish militant groups bombed British installations. Arab fighters ambushed Jewish convoys. The British announced they would withdraw from Palestine in May 1948, leaving the two sides to fight it out. Everyone knew a full-scale war was coming. On April 13, 1948, a convoy of Jewish medical personnel was ambushed on the road to Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus in Jerusalem. The convoy carried doctors, nurses, students, and patients. Arab fighters attacked with rifles and Molotov cocktails. British security forces in the area failed to intervene effectively. 77 people were killed in what became known as the Hadassah Convoy Massacre. Churchill was not at the massacre site, but he was involved in the aftermath. The surviving Jewish medical staff at Hadassah Hospital were now trapped on Mount Scopus, surrounded by hostile territory. They could not leave safely. They could not receive supplies. They faced the prospect of slow starvation or violent death. Churchill organized the evacuation. He coordinated with British military units, Jewish authorities, and Arab leaders to arrange safe passage for the trapped personnel. He personally oversaw the operation, moving through contested areas with the same calm authority he had shown on battlefields across Europe. 700 Jewish doctors, students, and patients were evacuated from Mount Scopus under his protection. When asked later about his approach to the dangerous negotiations, Churchill offered a characteristically simple explanation. People were less likely to shoot at someone who was smiling at them. It was the same psychology he had applied throughout his military career. Confidence, composure, and a refusal to show fear could accomplish what firepower could not. Churchill left Palestine shortly before the British withdrawal in May 1948. The State of Israel was declared. The Arab-Israeli War began. The violence that Churchill had witnessed was only the beginning of a conflict that would continue for decades. He returned to Britain with his military career winding down. He was 41 years old. He had fought in the greatest war in human history. He had survived wounds, capture, and concentration camps. He had earned decorations that most soldiers could only dream of, and he had no idea what to do with the rest of his life. The British Army offered him training assignments, staff positions, administrative roles. Churchill accepted them without enthusiasm. He qualified as a parachutist in his 40 seconds, jumping from aircraft just to feel the rush of adrenaline again. He trained new generations of soldiers in Commando tactics, passing on the skills he had learned in Scotland and applied across Europe. But peacetime soldiering could never match the intensity of war. Churchill needed something else. Some new challenge, some way to feel alive again. He found it in the most unlikely place imaginable. The man who had fought with swords and longbows, who had stormed beaches with bagpipes screaming, who had escaped from Nazi concentration camps, was about to discover a new passion. He was about to become one of the first surfers in British history. On July 21st, 1955, a 48-year-old British Army officer stood on the banks of the River Severn in Gloucestershire, England. He was holding a homemade surfboard, watching the water for signs of the tidal bore, a wave that travelled up the river from the Bristol Channel twice each day. Local fishermen thought he was mad. They had seen waves on the Severn for generations, but no one had ever tried to ride one. Jack Churchill paddled out into the brown water and waited. The bore appeared as a white line on the horizon, moving upstream against the current. It was not a large wave by ocean standards, perhaps 5 feet at its peak, but it was a wave, and Churchill was determined to ride it. He caught the bore and surfed it for over a mile upstream, becoming one of the first people in Britain to ride a river wave. It was exactly the kind of absurd, unnecessary, slightly dangerous activity that had defined his entire life. He was not content to watch the wave pass. He had to be on it, had to feel it beneath him, had to master it the way he had mastered the longbow, the broadsword, and the bagpipes. Churchill retired from the British Army in 1959 with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. He had served for over 30 years, fought in one world war and several smaller conflicts, earned decorations from multiple nations, and survived experiences that would have killed most men 10 times over. He was 52 years old, and finally at peace with civilian life. His retirement was as eccentric as his military career. He developed a passion for radio-controlled model boats, building elaborate warships and sailing them on ponds near his home. He refurbished old steamboats and piloted them along the Thames between Richmond and Oxford. He continued to play the bagpipes at memorial ceremonies and regimental gatherings, a living connection to the Commando traditions he had helped create. His daily commute became legendary among fellow train passengers. Churchill would ride the train home from London each evening, and as the train passed his neighbourhood, he would open the window and throw his briefcase out onto the tracks. Startled, passengers assumed he had lost his mind. In fact, Churchill had calculated the exact spot where his garden bordered the railway line. The briefcase landed in his backyard every time, saving him the trouble of carrying it from the station. When people asked about his wartime exploits, Churchill was modest. He did not boast about the Germans he had killed or the prisoners he had captured. He did not exaggerate his role in operations or claim credit for victories that belonged to others. He simply told the truth, which was extraordinary enough without embellishment. His son Malcolm later recalled that his father would discuss the war openly with anyone who asked, particularly over a glass of wine in the evening, but he never sought attention for his deeds. The years passed. Churchill watched the world change around him. The British Empire dissolved. The Cold War divided Europe. New technologies transformed warfare beyond recognition. Guided missiles replaced artillery. Jet aircraft replaced propeller planes. Nuclear weapons made conventional combat seem almost quaint. The kind of war Churchill had fought with swords and bagpipes, and personal courage became a historical curiosity. Churchill died on March 8, 1996, at the age of 89. He had outlived most of his comrades from the Commandos, most of his fellow prisoners from Sachsenhausen, most of the men he had led into battle across Europe. He died peacefully in Surrey, England, surrounded by family, a lifetime removed from the frozen beaches of Norway and the burning hills of Yugoslavia. The obituaries struggled to capture his life. One British newspaper wrote that if Churchill had not existed, it would have been impossible to invent him. No fictional hero with his story would seem credible. A man who killed enemies with a longbow in the age of tanks, a man who captured prisoners with a sword in the age of machine guns, a man who played bagpipes while mortars exploded around him, a man who escaped from a Nazi concentration camp and walked 150 kilometers to freedom, a man who surfed river waves and threw briefcases from trains and refused to accept that the modern world had no place for medieval warriors. Jack Churchill was not the most decorated soldier of the Second World War. He was not the most successful commander or the most brilliant tactician. He did not win any decisive battles or change the course of history through strategic genius. What he did was simpler and perhaps more important. He proved that individual courage still mattered. He proved that unconventional thinking could overcome superior firepower. He proved that one man with enough determination could accomplish what armies could not. His legacy lives on in the commandos he helped create, in the special operations forces that trace their lineage to those Scottish training grounds, in every soldier who has ever been told that something was impossible and refused to believe it. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about officers who captured prisoners with swords. Stories about soldiers who played bagpipes under mortar fire. Stories about men who escaped concentration camps and walked across mountains to fight again. Real people. Real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany, Norway? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us if you've ever heard of Mad Jack Churchill before today. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Jack Churchill does not disappear into silence. This man deserved to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.